Hi, this is Tom for PokerVIP.com and welcome to the second part of my review of John's gameplay in his Betfair Pot Limit Omaha Bankroll Challenge. So the first video was quite pre-flop dominant. There's going to be some continuation of that, but there's a lot more post-flop spots in this video to analyze. We're going to be using Odds Oracle as before. Other tools are available. I don't want it to make it appear like it's the only tool out there and make it appear like an Odds Oracle advert or commercial. Flopzilla's free. You can use that for just basic equity breakdown pre-flop. And I know a lot of other people use PokerJuice. It's a bit pricier than Odds Oracle. I think for the purpose of reviewing gameplay at this kind of stake level, Odds Oracle fits nicely into that kind of price range. But just say there's other stuff out there which all have their merits and the like. So with that being said, we're going to start off. If you catch me glancing off screen again, that's because I have notes off screen just to make sure I'm keeping to script somewhat and remembering to mention everything that I've kind of noted watching the video beforehand. So we're going to hit play. So John is playing heads up on the right hand table, and straight off the bat we have an interesting hand. We're just going to pause it here. So John goes for the 3-bet with the double suited kings, which is entirely reasonable in a heads up spot. It's going to play slightly different than like a traditional heads up game, just because it's six-handed table that happens to be heads up. I don't have any stats on any player. John hasn't provided that or any context. So I'm just going to analyze this hand as it is in a vacuum. But any player dynamics could make this play somewhat better or somewhat worse depending on the dynamics that are going on in this hand. So first off, we like the 3-bet. This is definitely going to be towards the top of our 3-betting range. We're very happy. But when we get 4-bet, we're a little more concerned. And the concern is namely that our opponent has aces here. So we touched earlier in the previous video about how most 4-bets are going to be ace dominant. And that's going to be slightly different heads up, but it's not going to be wildly different, I don't think, in this spot. So my play here would be to call and continue the times, obviously, that we hit king, but also that we flop flush draws, we flop straight draws, and we have the pair to back it up. But I'm trying to find a way not to go broke versus aces here. John decides to go for the 5-bet option. And I think the problem with this is that by 5-betting, he's probably removing all the hands he's beating out of his opponent's range. I think he's only ever going to get action off aces and potentially the other kings. But I mean, given he has 2 of the kings, that's incredibly unlikely. And there's going to be far more ace combos in his opponent's range than there are going to be king combos. So I broke down kind of exactly what I thought was going on here with some results from Odds Oracle that I've saved. So the first one to sort of break down is if I consider my opponent to have a 5% 4-betting range, which is somewhat typical. That's kind of how the equity's breaking out. It's not doing particularly well. We've got more than the 2.1% required to, sorry, the 2-to-1 pre-flop required to call. But by 5-betting, we're really kind of, pushing it too far. I then kind of altered the stats a bit and changed it to 8%. You can see that we're still behind. So we've really got to assume our opponent's got a particularly wide 4-bet range to make this a remotely profitable spot. And I actually had to push it up to a full 10% before we found a spot in which the equity kind of broke in such a way that it would be a profitable spot to get it in. We're not so worried about flop equity distribution here, just because the stack spot ratio has been altered so much by it being a 4-bet spot already that the flop equity distribution isn't really going to matter as much as it would do in a single raised or potentially even 3-bet pot. So yeah, it's not looking like a fantastic spot. I ran a couple of other things just to illustrate kind of that we're doing terribly against aces, but like hypothetically, if our opponent had double suited kings, or double suited ace king, sorry, which is what the XXYY represents in Odds Oracle, you can see that we're doing okay, but we're not miles ahead. And when we contrast that with how we are doing versus aces, we can see that the amount of equity we lose versus aces isn't made up by the times we're against the double suited broadways. In essence, what I'm saying is that we're far more behind the aces than we are ahead of the double suited ace king or ace queen combos. which are going to exist in the range, but they're going to be a far smaller percentage, I think, than the pure aces. It is a little bit of a cooler, but it would be a cooler. I'm trying to avoid going broken. Instead, maybe John has some history and some dynamics going on that I'm not aware of. So yeah, we run the tape, and you're going to see that they get it in, and his opponent does indeed have aces. And they're also kind of like the worst aces John can be against. He's got one of the kings covered, and he also has a higher flush draw, which is one of the worries. When we're playing 4-bet, 5-bet spots, is that opponents can have higher flush draws, which kind of greatly reduces the equity of our hand. And yeah, it's an unfortunate result, but one that I guess was a little bit predictable. Not in the sense that his opponent had the flush draw and the king, but predictable that his opponent had the aces. But yeah, a bit of a cooler. So double suited aces, he picks up a particularly nice flop. He goes for the c-bet. We're absolutely fans of that. He then turns it into a bluff catch mode, which again, opponent's going to have quite a lot of queen X in his range when he calls. His opponent can have hands, like worse flush draws, 10-9 draws, king 10 draws. Although obviously John is blocking some of the king 10 and 10-9 combos with his king and queen, king and 9 in his hand. And he's going to get checked through. He sizes half pot. I'd maybe go a tad smaller if we're going to be hypercritical, but I don't think it makes much of a difference because I really don't see how we're getting paid here. But it's it's a nice value bet. If we're playing a really crafty player that we're fearing a check raise from, then maybe we can potentially check back occasionally. But I think that's verging on the far too nitty for that to be something that we're doing consistently. Yeah, John's just going to get it through, I think, if I remember correctly. I don't remember getting paid here. And yeah, he just picks up, which, yeah, is a reasonably fine result. This is another interesting hand, actually. So John opens, gets called, decides to bet his double gut shot. I would size slightly down from the 2.5. I'm going something like 1.752. I just don't think sizing up is going to necessarily alter the number of times you're getting folds or calls versus raises, and you're risking a bit too much money for the reward. And the added problem you have is that if a raise comes in, it's now that much bigger because you've bloated the size of the pot. And that is exactly what happens here, unfortunately. If Berkey goes for the raise, and John's now in a spot where he has a decision to make. And he elects to go for the call. Not really a fan of this call, and we're going to break down exactly why. So we're going to bring over Odds Oracle, and one of the things we can do in Odds Oracle is ask different questions as to what results can occur in the hand. So obviously going to ask the equity. We're also going to ask how often John, who's player 5 in this instance, will have the nut high on the river, as in how many times is he going to make his hand. And also we're going to ask interactive hand stats for the turn, which is basically what is John's hand strength going to be on the turn, typically, irrespective of what his opponent's range is. So I gave his opponent a raising range containing the 2 pairs. I didn't contain the bottom 2 pair with the exception of the ones with straight draws. You could add the bottom 2 pair if you wanted to here. Some kind of like 13 card straight draws, although he's blocking some of those, so there's less of them, but they will still exist, and the sets. We came to a result where John is very, very marginally getting a slightly better equity result than the 2-to-1 price that he's being offered. But this is kind of like wherein lies the problem, which is the post-flop playability. So I asked how often would John have the nut high on the river, and the answer came back 17% of the time. And I asked how likely, like what will his hand strength be on the turn? And as you can see, he's going to miss a lot. And the times he doesn't miss, he's actually going to be connecting in ways that he can't continue, as in he makes a lesser pair, which is going to be a pair lower than the jack. He is occasionally going to make a top pair, which is going to be the form of the 8 to the king, and he's only making the straight 18% of the time. And to be honest, in this spot, he has to hit the straight to continue. But there's also the issue of, if he hits the straight, how on earth is he going to get paid? He's obviously made the call somewhat for the implied odds, which is kind of understandable to a point. However, we do have the added disadvantage in this hand of being out of position. If we're in position, we can obviously then control action and determine, to a greater extent, the size of the pot and attempt to extract value. When we're out of position, we're basically left with three choices on the turn if we're hypothetically we do hit our straight here. And the three choices are that we can go for the check call and hope that our opponent fires river, which might happen if he's on the really strong side of range. But if a straight card comes and we're still calling down when we've called with what our opponent now sees as a cap range, he's going to assume that we're going to raise all our sets, on the flop. We're not going to slow play, which is probably a fair assumption in most instances as a population read. So he's basically put us on some weak two pairs and some straights, and he's going to assume that those weak two pairs are going to eventually fold out, and that what he's left with continuing is going to be some straights. So we might potentially get a turn bad out of him and then a check on the river. We can go for the check raise. Problem by doing that is we are basically screaming strength as to how strong our hand is, and it's very unlikely to get called unless we're playing a very, very loose player, in which case the value heavy line is fine, but that's going to be against a very kind of niche part of the population. Or we can lead, and leading does look quite strong, but it does also allow our opponent to call, and then we can maybe size like a third to half of pot just to try and like value own the guy. But the point is, being out of position is just going to make our life significantly more difficult. And yeah, the hand's just not really durable enough on the turns. And as we see, John's managed to turn top pair here, but given the action, top pair's really not going to get the job done. So run the tape, and yeah, he's going to face a rather large bet. Yeah, he's actually facing a pot-sized bet on the turn, and once that happens, he's got no chance of continuing with just the double gut shot. He's not even sure if his two pair out's alive. I suspect if his opponent's potting, they probably aren't. And hypothetically, if our opponent's on like Jack 7 or has improved to King Jack potentially, which could happen, if the ace comes off, that's going to hit a decent part of our two pair range. So it's kind of difficult even to get paid if we happen to miracle a better two pair here. So he makes a good fold, but I think I much favour that call in position rather than out of position. So yeah, I'm not sure he's going to extract quite enough value in that spot. As I remember, the table on the right hand side is now going to break. We're not going to play many more heads up hands here, which, given John's bankroll relative to the stakes he's playing, is probably a good idea that he doesn't play this high. That's a reasonably standard just bet pick up. Nothing more really needs to be said about that. Yeah, he's going to close this table and switch another one in. Right, so the left-hand table, we have John 3-betting, as the video jumps a bit, we have John 3-betting the King, Queen, 10-4. And he is going to get called. And we're just going to input the hand manually on Odds Oracle. We cannot find interactive hand stats saved, unfortunately. So the point of this is just to illustrate kind of how well this hand is doing, even in a spot where it's ostensibly somewhat kind of like vulnerable to being raised. So as I clear this question, we're going to run the stats, and we're just going to ignore that and go down to the interactive hand stats. And it's basically going to tell us how well we're doing versus, in general, how well we're going to do on just about any turn card. And the point is that we're going to be making, worst case scenario, we're going to have a lot of top pairs with redraws. We're going to make a lot of two pairs. We're going to make trips. We're going to make straights. The point is there's a lot of potential with this hand, just to sort of kind of illustrate that some of these aren't necessarily nutted outs, but when the stacked pot's a lot lower, that's less important. So yeah, just to illustrate that this hand has quite a lot of potential and quite a lot of durability here. As it is, I think John just bets and picks up, if memory serves me right, which is absolutely fine. And yeah, we're going to skip forward a little bit to the hand on the left-hand table. So John calls it, and this is just absolutely far too wide. We're not going to break it down. We went through a hand that was very similar, the 9-8-3-4. Yeah, basically calling here is just going to be hugely optimistic. So it gets checked round, and John decides to bet his bottom pair and open-ended to the weakest part of the straight, which is going to be on the optimistic side, to be honest with you. I'm far more of a fan of just betting, just checking here and taking a turn, and if we happen to hit a straight, if we happen to hit trips, etc., and action is still somewhat passive, then we can start reconsidering exactly where we are in the hand. But at this point in time, we are unlikely to get this bet through three people, and our hand can't really stand too many raises. It's just it is effectively at this point just bottom pair and a bit of potential to a non-nut out, or one part of a non-nut straight. The deuce makes us the nuts, the seven does not. Sorry, the seven makes us the 8-5. Sorry, I'm being stupid. But still, just a weak open ender is going to be kind of on the ambitious side. So we get raised, which is kind of exactly what we didn't want, and we also get raised by the player who has the kind of the strongest range. And by that I mean that he has checked here, so he's basically checked to the razor and hasn't, that check doesn't indicate anything about his hand strength. The other two players have checked, which I guess is influenced why John has decided to bet flop. It makes them far less likely to have a particularly strong hand, although they can still check calls some flush draws here that just don't want to bloat the pot. And that's another reason why betting here has some significant drawbacks. Just that some of these straight outs, if the diamond comes, hypothetically the deuce or the seven of diamond comes off, we're left with a hand that's basically a bluff catcher, not much else, and we can't extract value from it. It's not a great spot. John goes for the call, and he happens to absolutely just crush the turn, which is a pretty good result for him, to be absolutely truthful. But it's a result that's actually very, very, very unlikely. So again, we're just going to whip over odds oracle just to sort of illustrate how unlikely this instance was, and it's just going to illustrate sort of the number of times that we're going to have a weak hand here. We're going to have a lesser pair or a lesser two pair over 3/4 of the time, and basically any weak two pair, etc., facing a raise is not going to be able to call. So he's going to make trips 4.3% of the time and straight 18% of the time. And yeah, I mean that's very much not a particularly good percentage anyway you cut it, and that's not including the times that he makes the trips and makes the straights, and that still makes somebody a flush and is going to have reverse implied odds problems going on with that. So as it is, he happens to turn the absolute nuts, and yeah, money is just going in at this point. And his opponent had somehow managed to overplay a six with a nut flush draw. So John manages to make the absolute most he could there, but kind of in a spot that is somewhat weird to do so. Right hand table, perfectly reasonable line up until now. Excuse me. He's flopped okay, nothing special. Just taking the check down line is absolutely reasonable. Which is exactly what's going to happen. Yeah, his opponent's got queens, which he's playing as a bluff catcher, which is absolutely fine. John's taking showdown with the chance he has the best hand, and yeah, nothing more needs to be said about that. So the left hand table call the call pre is absolutely fine. But he then decides to call the 3-bet from the fairly short stack player. And he's just got a massive issue here, and the issue really is the stack to pot ratio is still so small that he's just going to have to hit that often. Yeah, he's just not going to be doing well enough here. So we're going to again sort of plug some maths into odds oracle just to sort of illustrate the problems John has here. But I think for most people who watched the first video, it's still going to be fairly sort of explanatory as to the problem that John has here, really. So we're going to whip over odds oracle. So I mean, the first thing, I've given the 3-better a 15% range, which seems pretty reasonable given the fact that he's 3-betting to two people, he's expecting action. Maybe he goes a touch wider than 15%, but I think 15 is fine. Equity-wise, we're doing pretty shockingly. But it's just going to illustrate that really John is not going to flop, particularly well that often. Oh, excuse me, I put the wrong. Oh no, no, I haven't. Yeah, I have put the wrong thing. I've left the board in from the previous one. Apologies. Yeah, so that maths looks far more standard. I was wondering why the stats were so over the place. So yeah, we're still behind, but obviously 78% was crazy. I was wondering why that was coming up. Handy tip would be to delete the board before. So yeah, we're just illustrating the fact that John is basically not going to flop too often, too well. He's going to. The hand has some potential, but it's not going to flop particularly special. We're really looking at the bottom end of what John has to flop here. Like if he flops just top pair, he's obliged to go with it purely from a like a math point, but he's not going to be ahead in all probability. So he really needs to start flopping the two pairs, the sets, the straights, the flushes, which are very, very difficult to flop. As anyone that plays any form of poker will kind of be aware, able to tell you. So yeah, he's left himself in a really awkward stacked spot. His opponent has less than a pot size bet back. He's going to have to be in a spot where he has to hit. As we've touched before, as to spots where John actually made good folds to three bets. When we have hands like ace ten, we're going to be against higher aces, which have bigger kickers, which means that hitting the ace loses its value. We're still out kicked. So yeah, and a flop like this, John just has to fold his gut shot, and he's just lost a few extra big blinds there, which is yeah, just a bit sort of bit unfortunate, really. So yeah, right hand table. He elects to fold, and that seems fairly tight fold, to be honest. It also kind of like indicates his lack of an overall plan. If he's calling hands like 5-8, 3-4, multi-way, why is he folding ace queen 8-4 versus a button range, which is going to be significantly wider than someone's under the gun range, which has then had two calls, sorry, one call afterwards. It kind of indicates the sort of an element of randomness in the play, which we should have a general overall idea. If the ranges that we have in our head are not perfectly nailed down, we should still have like ballpark ideas of what we're going to play. And folding a strong hand against a button range, but playing a weak hand versus under the gun range, just isn't really making much sense. Yeah, kind of a bit of a head scratcher, that one, to be honest. So yeah, we're going to run the tape, and left-hand table, John's going to open too wide here. Under the gun, we've really got to be careful. Again, we're going to be playing a lot of hands multi-way. We're thinking about hands with multi-way potential. So we're going to be playing, as I said in the previous video, something between 10.5% and 13%. And this isn't going to fall into it. It's going to fall into sort of a cutoff range, maybe a really aggressive under the gun +1 range, but even then, that seems very loose. And yeah, it's just got multi-way playability problems, which in that it can't make nut flushes. It can't make it's dead on most ace high boards. It's a little gappy, and yeah, he's just going to end up check folding here, which is pretty normal, I think. On the right hand table, not really much to be said about that hand. That seemed pretty standard from where I was sitting. So yeah, he's going to fold here. We're just going to skip forward to the next interesting bit. So he's made a pretty loose defend here with the threes, but has flopped the absolute bejesus out of it. And if you're going to flop this well, I think raising is absolutely standard. Like the way he's raised it, try and get the money in as best he can. What I would say on turn is, that I don't think, given the fact that the turn card's fairly brickish, really, I mean, it's only really going to help three kings, which, how does he have kings? It's only really kings in the flush draw, which likely get it on flop. I prefer going something like 8 or 9 just to like try and level someone into doing something spewy. It's probably not going to work anyway, but it looks a bit weaker than just mashing the pot button here. But I like the stacks pot manipulation on the flop. I like the fact he's trying to play for stacks with this hand. And yeah, I don't think he's just played it. The pre-flop decision I question, but the post-flop play is fantastic. Okay. So yeah, he makes another tight fold out the small blind. I mean, I guess I favour that one slightly more than the previous one with the ace queen 8-4, but it still seems a bit tight. Although reasonable, it's far from terrible. Love the double suited ISO with the aces. It's absolutely the way to go. You know, punish the limper, especially when you're like right at the top of your range like this. This is absolutely fine. And yeah, we're absolutely huge fan of this. And yeah, he's managed to still have the overpair. He's got some two backdoor flush draws. He goes on the large side. You can maybe fire like 80 cents, 90 cents rather than the full dollar, but I don't think it makes a massive difference here. He's opening on the left-hand table with a double paired hand, single suited. Again, cut off like that. That's a good play. We're a big fan of that. So we're going to pause it here. So on the turn, on the right-hand table, he's got quite an interesting card. You know, he's improved his hand from the point of view. He's picked up a flush draw. He's also picked up the gut shot to the ace queen. But it is going to complete a decent amount of our opponent's range. Our opponent's going to have a lot of king jack, a lot of king nine, and straight cards. You know, if you think of a jack nine flop, you know, the way it lines up, there's going to be a number of combos, whether it be two pair or straight, that are going to very much benefit from the king. It's only really the bottom end of the straight combos that aren't. So, you know, hands like jack 10, 9, 8, for example. So it's actually quite a scary card. So I would be a fan of checking this back, but it's kind of at the top of our check back range. You know, we still have a huge amount of equity in the form of the flush draw and straight draw. But if we bet and get action, we're just against two pair or better. And, you know, whereas potentially the aces now and the 10 and the hearts are most certainly out, it's not going to be 50% equity that we sort of would like here, you know, to make it a flip. Right hand table, he's going big. I'd maybe size down a bit, but the idea of betting is absolutely fine. So right hand table, he decides to pot. If he's going to pot, if you're going to bet, pot is the size to go. You just commit yourself, makes your hand look pretty strong. I said I would probably favour mixing some checks in here, and then using it as a bluff catcher on river when you have some blockers. And of course, the times you just happen to, you know, hit the nuts and you know, you've kind of capped your range in a way to extract value. As it is, I think his opponent folds here, if I can remember correctly. Yeah, it does, yeah. But yeah, it's a fairly scary card to barrel on, but you know, it's certainly the aggressive approach. It's far from terrible, but it is quite a scary turn card from the point of view of our hand. But I guess range-wise, it's not terrible either, so it's a bit of a randomizer. Queen Jack deuce 5. This is going to be too loose and open. We're going to break down why. So we are going to have some double suited combos in our under the gun range, just kind of have some board coverage, but it's going to be the higher elements, and that's going to be like Queen Jack 10 9 double suited. Ones, you know, don't have the gaps, and they're a bit higher as well. We can make higher flushes, make higher straights. And to illustrate that, I plugged a couple of things into Odds Oracle. So I just you know, plugged into Odds Oracle how we're doing versus an 8% 3-bet range. If we run the hand a bit, I do believe we get 3-bet, which is why I've done this. I think we get 3-bet by the button. Yeah, we do. So it's going to get folded around, if I remember correctly, and then John's going to make the call, which, you know, is a fine call given the situation he's found himself in. But I think the you know, and he has reasonable equity. He has his flop equity distribution here is acceptable. It's not terrible, but to kind of illustrate why we're raising hands like the one I plugged in, which is Queen Jack 10 9 double suited rather than the Queen Jack 8 9. The equity is very similar, but the flop equity distribution is better. We've got a 10% sort of spike in the flop equity distribution, which is, you know, 10% is a big deal, and it's basically going to mean we're going to be able to continue on far more flops and potentially make nut hands and win, you know, on far more turns and rivers. And that's the problem that this hand has. It's just a bit too gappy. It's absolutely fine to put in a later position raise. You know, cut off raise, absolutely fine, fantastic. But under the gun, it's just a little bit too loose. And as it is, I think John's going to, you know, end up check folding the spot with just a gut shot and some backdoor flush draws. Question why his opponent went so large, but, you know, it doesn't really make a difference what his opponent size is. He's in a spot where he can't continue. So yeah, it's yeah, just an unfortunate spot. Double seated aces on the right hand table. He is going to be three betting here, I would fully assume. Right, on the left hand table, we've got a limp spot. There's two ways to play this. We can either check and kind of play for a play a showdown game, or we can just try and bet and pick it up against a random range. Either's fine. He's going to elect for the check route. The problem by checking is if we get bet into, this hand really doesn't improve, so we're really playing it as just the value of the king eight, which is not much value really. Whereas betting it, okay, we can shut down if we happen to get called, but we're basically just protecting our equity. Admittedly, it is only folding out stuff that we're already beat by, but sorry, that we're already beating. But it is protecting the equity with a hand that's quite vulnerable, so I'm A-okay with that. Double suited aces looks like we're just 5-bet getting it in, which is absolutely fine. And yeah, this illustrates sort of like how this hand doesn't play particularly well post flop. And yeah, he's just going to fold the turn, I would imagine. And the double suited aces, we're just going to chop up. But it's the reason we're 3-betting and 4-betting is so that we can get spots in like that. Unfortunately, our opponent happened to have the other aces and we didn't free roll him, but it does happen. We're going to make a really tight fold on the right-hand table. It seems like complete for me. It's not even a raise. It's half a big blind with a hand that's got a reasonable amount of potential. Especially if we're playing really loose and playing the 8-5s and 3-4s and all that sort of junk, then hands like the king queen 9-4, it puzzles me as to why we're not playing that. Yeah, it's a bit unfortunate as to why he's folding there. Don't mind the defend to the min bet from John here. Yeah, if it's full size raise, maybe we can fold, but to a min bet, it's verging on the tight for me to fold. And I think he's going to call here. The problem we have, we do have top pair. It's difficult to see where we go from here. To really continue, we either need a club or a 6, 10, some 2-pair combo. So there's ways for us to continue, but we're gonna every time we brick, we're gonna have to fold turn, I would imagine here. And when our opponent's betting into 2 people for pot, we do have to give him some element of credit, whether it be a better queen, whether it be an overpair with a flush draw, queen with a flush draw. There's some significant problems that we have here. Right-hand table, like the ISO with the jacks, and yeah, our opponent's potting here. I would have almost certainly followed the turn here. We have just queen 9. And our opponent's kind of really screaming the fact that they love their hand. They've potted twice, and with limited ways to improve, I'm not really sure why he's deciding to call down here. Maybe he has a read that I don't know. The guy has played pretty aggressive since John hit the 5-3 straight on him, but so possibly he's tilting. But even so, there's definitely better hands to bluff catch with here. I mean, the good thing is we don't have the reverse blockers with the having spades, etc. So we're not removing those from our range. But yeah, the opponent turns out with 2-pair, well, flop 3-pair for top 2 on flop. Yeah, that seems pretty reasonable given the line he took. So yeah, not massively surprised there. Yeah, John gets a pretty awful flop on the right-hand table. I like the open with the jacks. It's definitely a good open on the button. And he has managed to flop the absolute world. Top set, flush draw. He's, I guess, if we're being hypercritical, blocking his own full house, but he's loving life on this flop. Don't mind the check with jacks at all. Heads up we can consider betting, but into 2 seems very aggressive. And yeah, I like the sizing. I think if you hit the board so hard, it's actually quite difficult to size much larger than that. The turn is the turn does complete the 7-5, but even if hypothetically our opponent has a 7-5, we still have the full house redraws, the flush redraws. So I'm absolutely fine with John betting again here, and that's what he's going to do. Again, I might size down a tad, but extracting value is I guess never a terrible idea. And yeah, he just picks up, so that's absolutely fine. And we are going to skip forward a little bit. um, to the Jack 559 double suited. I think on the left hand table he's just folding his gut shot. I don't think much happens there from memory. So yeah, John makes the defense. If this were heads up, it's slightly less appealing to defend it, given the SPR. Although we should be defending wider in heads up, it's kind of like counterintuitive. But the stack size, given the fact it has less than 100 big blinds, is somewhat different. We know we are playing with the same guy on the upper table, so we know he's playing fairly loose. His hand is double suited. It has potential. But we do have to be somewhat careful with it in that it doesn't make so many nut hands. But it's an okay defend. So we're going to run the tape, and we flop 3 nines, which is a pretty good result at this point. If we're being hyper nervous, then there are hands that beat us, but there's not so many of them. So it gets checked round, and I think by in this spot with a check, we can assume that Nezam basically doesn't have much. It's theoretical that he might have been able to check a flush draw as two, given the paired board, but he's basically capped his range. So we're not really so worried about this. So this almost becomes a heads-up spot just because we assume Nezam's going to fold. Even if he has a flush, we can put pressure on it. But he's not going to value bet particularly large with a flush on a paired board into 2 people. And the 7's just really not going to hit his range too often. So John hits the check button instantly, which I actually am not a massive fan of. I actually think, given Nezam's cap range, I think if the player in the small blind had checked, we can bet here for value. There's a very slim chance that we're against a flush, but we still have ways to improve. And by betting here, said we're not super worried about Nezam. It allows us to check river versus Oppu, and kind of control the size of the pot. As it is, Oppu's decided to pot, which, given the fact that he's doing into one person he's almost certain to fold, is a very aggressive line. John goes for the call, which I think is okay. He starts to worry about some flushes, although they don't necessarily sort of size up here. So it's a very polarizing line to a full house, and John has not so many redraws versus that. He does against the 9-7, but the king 9 he's dead against. And some flushes which we do have redraws versus, but the presence of a pair is actually kind of hurting our ability to redraw. That being said, I think calling here is absolutely reasonable, but we're going to reevaluate on river. And if Oppu really sizes up on river, we just, I think, have to give him credit for the full house. Somewhat disappointingly. So yeah, we get to an 8 river. From our point of view, we haven't improved. There are going to be some 9s that fire turn that improve on the 9-8. 9-8 is a reasonably common combo from small blind. So we have to be somewhat worried about this run out, and we're going to be finding. If our opponent fires something like a third to half, it gets really awkward. If he goes much larger than that, I'm just folding. Excuse me. As it is, Oppu's decided to pot, and it's really difficult to see how this line is ever going to be a bluff, which we need it to be. Even if our opponent's overplaying a 9, he's likely overplaying a 9 of the variety of ace-9 and queen-9, which still beat us. It's very difficult to see him just absolutely losing his mind with 10-9. And for him to have an absolutely naked bluff here, how does he fire 2 streets on complete air? I'm sure it's possible, but it's very, very unlikely. So yeah, it's a pretty flat out disgusting spot, really. It's one that I'm going to be folding though. I just can't see how this ever bluff. As like a population read, a pot line in micro stakes PLO is almost certainly the nuts. So yeah, it's just going to be a spot where I'm going to fold, and if I call, I'm expecting to lose and him to roll over king 9, maybe even king's full. Maybe 9-8 would be bottom of range I'd give him. But basically, I'm expecting to see a full house of some variety. And yeah, we're obviously not beating that. I don't expect him to have many flushes here. I don't think a flush ever goes pot here. But if it does, it gives us even more credence to fold, because it can't be that either. So anyway, we run the tape, and John, I think, makes a questionable call here, if memory serves me right. Yeah, and he goes for the call, and opponent rolls over 3 kings. I mean, double suited kings here is kind of a surprise, to be totally honest. I mean, there's some weak king combos I can imagine here, like, king, king, 8, deuce, rainbow. Double suited kings that didn't 3-bet seems absurdly tight to me. And if we were in this situation with this hand, I would have been 3-betting every time. But it would be something to make a note about, that your opponent's particularly tight pre-flop. You are going to have certain people at these stakes who just don't 3-bet at all. They're very passive pre-flop. And it's important to tag them and make sure that you have that kind of awareness about them, so that you're aware that these kind of random things can happen, and that hands that are this strong can show up even in a spot where they've played quite a passive line pre. So yeah, hopefully John made a note about that one. I know I certainly would have done. So then skip forward to the last few hands, and the jacks. It's an aggressive raise. It's certainly a cutoff raise onto the gun +1. It seems a little more ropey. But I mean, if it's a particularly tight table and you're not getting much multi-way play, then it potentially becomes more of a raise. On loose tables where we're going to have to take the hand multi-way, it's less attractive. Like the check on flop really doesn't help us. That being said, I'm kind of puzzled why he's 5-turn here. His opponent has the capability of checking a bear queen back, and by betting turn, he's basically kind of repping a turn draw of some variety. Probably most common one would be Jack 10, which I guess he kind of has a draw in King Jack. Maybe he's got to read that this guy, when he checks flop, just gives up a lot and folds, in which case I'm kind of a fan of the bet. In general, it seems a little random, and maybe showdown's the better route, but that's going to be player dependent. I don't think he maybe needs to size up quite as large. He goes for the check on river. His opponent checks back. I mean, I guess he got value, so I mean, he must have a read on the guy. And yeah, he showed up with a gut shot, a flush draw, and a pair. So I guess that would make an element of sense. But that's a weird hand for him to call pre anyway. Raise under the gun from double suited king queen. It's towards the bottom of our under the gun range, but it does fit in there just about. It's going to be in there for board coverage. It plays okay. And I like the fact he's checking his pair and gut shot with backdoor draws here. He can't get action off better, really. Especially against 3 people. It's just going to lead to some enormous problems later in the piece. And the hand on the right-hand table, love the raise. It's a fantastic hand. Top pair and straight draw. We're fine with leading here. If we get raised, we can kind of reconsider how things are. Good fold with the 9 and gut shot not chasing there, and we just pick up here, which is absolutely fantastic from our point of view. And that is the end of John's second session that he sent me. So a bit more post-flop play there. Yeah, I think overall he's played reasonably well in this session. There's been a few things he's done wrong, but it's definitely a better stand of a play than the first video he sent me. So yeah, that covers the second video. Hopefully I'll see you for part 3, and I've been Tom for PokerVIP.com.